Usually, when we talk about a forensic or like a medical diagnosis, there's this baseline expectation of precision.
Right, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor simply points at the screen.
Mm.
The fracture is just a physical reality. It exists independently of anyone's opinion, you know?
Absolutely. The evidence is binary, it's clean, and it's inherently trustworthy because it's just a direct imprint of physical truth.
Yeah, exactly. We really rely on that tangibility.
We do, because in the physical sciences, evidence doesn't have an agenda. I mean, a fractured ulna doesn't change its shape depending on who's holding the X-ray film.
Right. But then, you step out of the hospital and into the world of historical archives or state narratives and political trauma, and that diagnostic certainty just shatters.
It really does, because you aren't looking at a direct physical imprint anymore.
No, you're looking at an interpretation of an event.
Yep.
One that's drawn by a human hand, and, well, often a hand attached to a massive self-interested state apparatus. The diagnostic landscape of the past is super murky.
Yeah, the X-ray itself might literally be a forgery.
Exactly. Which brings us to the incredibly dense, profoundly controversial diagnostic challenge we are diving into today for you, the listener.
Yes, and this is a big one.
We're unpacking a highly provocative study dated March 2026. It's titled The Bucharest Pogrom, Anatomy of a Massive Hoax.
And we need to be really clear right up front about what this text is doing. The author of this text is attempting a fundamental structural rewrite of the widely documented violent events that took place in Romania between January 21st and 23rd, 1941.
Right, and before we delve into the mechanics of this author's argument, we have to issue a mandatory disclaimer for this deep dive.
Absolutely crucial.
We are undertaking a strictly impartial examination of the source material provided today. As hosts, we are not endorsing, we are not validating, and we are not taking sides on the author's claims.
Right, because this author is directly challenging the established historical consensus regarding the Holocaust in Romania. It's highly sensitive.
Highly sensitive. So our function today is solely to unpack the arguments, trace the logistical logic, and, examine the forensic hypotheses exactly as they are presented in this specific text. We are not adopting them as absolute historical truth.
We are essentially holding the author's blueprint up to the light. We just want to see how the architecture of their argument is built, step by step.
Yeah, and the core premise we'll be wrestling with is just staggering in its implications.
It really is.
I mean, what if the widely accepted historical narrative of a brutal 1941 massacre was, according to this author, an elaborate, meticulously staged frame job, one orchestrated by a military dictator using his own secret intelligence service?
The sheer scale of the assertion is what makes the text so provocative. I mean, the author is taking an event that has been documented, memorialized, and canonized in international historical records for over 8 decades.
Right.
And they're asserting that the true perpetrators have basically been hiding in plain sight this entire time.
They argue that historians have been studying a meticulously crafted theater set and basically mistaking it for the actual crime scene.
Exactly. But to understand how the author attempts to dismantle the accepted narrative, we first need to establish...
The text opens by quoting an AI-generated summary of the Bucharest Pogrom. The author uses this as a proxy for the mainstream historical consensus that anyone would find through a standard internet search today.
Yeah, and that summary outlines a really volatile political environment in January 1941. Romania was operating under this fragile, deeply fractured power-sharing agreement. It was known as the National Legionary State.
So who are the players here?
Well, on one side you had General Ion Antonescu. He was the conservative military head of state.
Okay.
And on the other side, you had the Legionary Movement, which was this fervent, far-right political organization.
Right, and the accepted history states that this power struggle boiled over into an open insurrection, right, the so-called Legionary Rebellion.
Exactly. And according to that standard narrative, under the cover of this chaotic rebellion, the legionaries rioted. The history says they specifically targeted and devastated Jewish neighborhoods in Bucharest, like Dudeti and Văcărești.
And this culminated in the murder of over 120 Jews.
Right. And the most notorious, visceral element of this narrative is a mass execution in the Jilava Forest.
The Jilava Forest. Okay, so that is the foundation of the historical record. But the author immediately isolates this narrative and categorizes it as a persistent myth, right?
Yes. A myth sustained by unverified axioms and a reliance on fabricated state documents.
But, and I think this is a super crucial distinction for the listener to grasp, The author isn't claiming the violence never happened.
No, not at all. It is not a denial of the death toll itself.
Right.
Far from it, actually. The author concedes that a violent insurrection absolutely occurred, property was indeed destroyed on a massive scale, and Jewish citizens were tragically murdered.
They're actually highly specific about the numbers, right?
Very specific. The author corrects the widely cited over 120 figure to exactly 116 Jewish victims. So the point of contention isn't the victims, it is entirely focused on the identity of the executioners.
Okay, it's akin to walking into a locked room mystery that has supposedly been solved for 85 years.
Right?
The author is basically standing in the middle of this historical crime scene, pointing at the legionary movement, the people the history books say are holding the smoking gun, and arguing that the lead detective investigating the crime actually planted the weapon in their hands.
That's a perfect analogy.
But I mean, how does a researcher even begin to prove a state-level cover-up of that magnitude almost a century later? It sounds impossible.
Well, what's fascinating here is their approach. They do it by entirely ignoring the secondary historical literature and going straight to the raw, real-time paper trail.
Okay.
The author's methodology relies on forensic textual analysis. Their logic is, if you want to uncover a manufactured narrative, you have to watch the state apparatus build it in real time.
Right, like in the hours and days immediately following the crisis.
Exactly. You look at the very first drafts of history.
Okay, so let's trace that paper trail with you, starting with what the author considers the genesis point of the official narrative.
Yeah.
And that is Marshal Antonescu's own personal diary.
Yes. Let's look at the entry for January 22, 1941.
It is stunningly brief. I mean, it's exactly 10 words long. The entry says, Kalei Rehovi and Dudadii are devastated and the Jews shot.
And the author isolates the grammatical structure of those 10 words as a massive, glaring evidentiary void.
The Jews shot.
Right now. The Jews shot. It is an entirely passive construction.
Yeah.
There is a notation of the geographic devastation and a notation of the fatal violence, but there's a complete omission of the perpetrator.
Which is weird, right?
In a highly classified private state diary, recorded on the very day the Capitol is allegedly being torn apart by a specific rebel group, the head of state does not name them as the killers.
Okay, but let me just push back on that interpretation for a second.
Sir, go ahead.
It's January 1941. The Capitol is under martial law. There is a literal armed insurrection happening in the streets, and communication networks are likely chaotic. Couldn't that passive voice simply be the fog of war?
It's a fair point.
I mean, is it not entirely plausible that a dictator, writing a hasty diary entry at the end of an insanely chaotic day, simply didn't have confirmed intelligence yet on who specifically was pulling the trigger in those neighborhoods? Jumping straight to malicious cover-up based on a passive verb feels like a massive leap to me.
And that is a highly logical counterargument. Honestly, if the diary entry existed in a vacuum, the fog of war would absolutely be the most rational explanation.
Right.
However, the author argues you cannot look at the diary in isolation. You must look at it as step one in a chronological progression.
Oh, okay.
The author tracks how this vague, passive notation metastasizes into a definitive accusation over the following weeks.
Okay, let's look at that timeline then. We move from that January 22nd diary entry to February 7th. The newspaper Universal publishes an official military communique. So this is no longer a private diary. This is the state speaking directly to the public.
And what does it say?
It lists 236 civilian dead across the capital, noting that 118 of those were Jews.
Exactly. Now, observe the language of that February 7th release. It provides a highly specific bureaucratic body count, yet it still lacks an attribution of guilt for the Jewish victims.
It's basically merely a statistical ledger at this point.
Yes. And it takes another 6 days until a subsequent communique on February 13th for the language to shift permanently.
Right. That's the document where the state explicitly claims those 118 Jews were executed by rebels.
Yes. So the author is highlighting a structural evolution in the state's messaging. Day 1, passive acknowledgement of deaths. Week 2, public release of the statistical arithmetic. Week 3, definitive assignment of blame to political rivals. The author posits that this timeline does not reflect a natural investigation uncovering facts. Instead, it reflects a state propaganda apparatus, taking time to calibrate its narrative, trying to figure out how to best leverage a crisis.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The author is using the state's own meticulous bookkeeping against them to point out arithmetic and narrative inconsistencies.
Oh, the math. Yes.
Let's look at the actual victim count. The author references Matatius Karp's post-war Black Book, which serves as kind of a foundational text for the accepted history.
Right.
Karp lists exactly 116 victims by name, 115 men and 1 woman, 2 additional unidentified bodies were found at a slaughterhouse, which brings the total to 118.
But then the author cross-references those historical totals with the primary source, documents from the Institute of Forensic Medicine, the IML.
The actual morgue files.
Exactly. The morgue files from those days list 108 Jewish bodies processed, and crucially, of those 108 bodies, 83 were transported specifically from the Jalava area.
Which isolates Jalava not just as a location, but as the absolute epicenter of the violence. Right?
I mean, if 83 out of 108 morgue admissions come from a single forest outside the city, whoever controlled Jalava essentially controlled the massacre.
Precisely. So naturally, the author subjects the initial documentation of the Jalava crime scene to intense scrutiny.
Yeah, they focus on a foundational document. A report dated January 24th, 1941, authored by Lieutenant Angelescu of the Ilfov Gendarmerie.
And this is significant because it's the very first official on-the-ground attempt by state law enforcement to explain the mechanics of the mass murder in the Jalava forest.
And the narrative contained within that police report is incredibly complex. I mean, it's almost cinematic.
It really is.
It states that on the night of January 21st to 22nd, unknown individuals transported 92 Jews by car out of the capital and shot them in the Sabar River Valley.
Now, the author immediately flags that phrase, unknown individuals, as a glaring structural flaw in the official history.
Yeah, that stands out. 2 days after the alleged Legionary Rebellion, the official gendarmerie report detailing the largest single mass casualty event of the entire crisis does not blame the legionaries, it blames unknowns.
That is bizarre.
Right. If, as the later narrative insists, this was a highly visible, politically motivated pogrom perpetrated by notorious local rebels, why does the investigating officer fail to identify a single perpetrator at the primary crime scene?
And the report's narrative actually gets even more convoluted from there.
Oh, it does.
It claims that out of those 92 people shot in the valley, 7 somehow survived the mass execution.
Right.
Wounded, they allegedly began walking back toward Bucharest. But en route, they were intercepted by local legionaries, taken to the Jalava town hall, and systematically executed by a specific group of local men.
Right, notably including a canteen worker named Petre Ivanescu and a mayor named Mihai Marin.
Okay, so the author subjects this report to a merciless stress test, starting with basic arithmetic.
The math here is really quite something. Let's break it down.
Let's do it.
The report claims 92 were shot and 7 survived, leaving 85 dead in the valley.
Okay, 85.
It then claims those 7 survivors, plus 2 more newly captured individuals, were taken to the town hall. That makes 9 captives.
Got it.
The narrative states 3 were killed, then later 5 more were killed. So the internal math of the gendarmerie report totals 91 victims.
91.
Yes. Yet the forensic medicine files, the actual bodies recovered from Jalava and processed by the state morgue total 87.
87 versus 91.
Exactly. The paper narrative and the physical reality are just completely misaligned.
Okay, so the math is sloppy, certainly. But honestly, my skepticism lies more with the physical logistics outlined in this report.
Oh, the cars.
Yes, the cars. Let's think about the reality of Bucharest in January 1941. The city is under a strict state of siege.
Right.
There's military lockdown, there's a nighttime curfew, and a strict blackout order. So how does a disorganized rebel group casually assemble a convoy of civilian cars, load up 92 uncooperative prisoners, and drive them out of a heavily militarized capital city to a forest?
Without anyone noticing.
Right. Without the Romanian army noticing, stopping, or questioning them. That seems insane.
And the author heavily relies on that exact logistical impossibility to break the state's narrative. Transporting nearly 100 unwilling humans is not a trivial task. It requires heavy infrastructure.
Yeah, massive amount.
It requires large-capacity trucks, immense amounts of fuel, coordinated drivers, and armed escorts to prevent mass panic or escape.
And civilian cars in 1941 were not high-capacity transit vehicles. I mean, you need dozens of cars, creating a massive, highly visible motorcade.
Precisely. To assert that a politically marginalized paramilitary group could orchestrate a convoy of that magnitude, undetected or unimpeded through military checkpoints manned by the regular army during martial law, it just defies basic operational logic.
It really does.
The author argues that the legionaries operating at the street level with civilian resources simply lacked the logistical architecture to execute the crime as it's described in the state's own gendarmerie report.
Okay, so if the initial police report is a mathematical failure and a logistical fantasy, it really begs a massive procedural question.
How did anyone go to jail for this?
Exactly. How did the state actually secure convictions? because 21 people were sent to a military tribunal and convicted of these murders. If the evidence was this full of holes, how did the judicial machinery even function?
Well, this requires a deep dive into the nature of authoritarian jurisprudence. Specifically, case number 2691941 before the Military Tribunal of the Capital Command, which kicked off in March 1941.
Okay.
The author characterizes this not as a factual inquiry, but as a heavily engineered show trial designed to produce a predetermined political outcome.
But wait, how does a military tribunal process a murder trial where the physical evidence like the bodies and the timeline are just a complete mess?
By bypassing the physical evidence entirely, they just relied on manufactured testimony. The prosecution built its case almost exclusively on informants. Notably, Rabbi Hurai Gutman, who was presented as a survivor, and a spectacularly dramatic written confession from one of the primary defendants.
Ah, the canteen worker, Petre Ivanescu.
Yes.
The author quotes Ivanescu's alleged suicide note extensively, and honestly, it is a fascinating piece of text to analyze.
Very revealing.
Ivanescu supposedly writes this confession in custody before killing himself. He details being ordered to execute the Jews at the town hall. He describes losing his mind, and then it climaxes with this incredibly theatrical declaration.
Right.
He claims he wouldn't shoot a Romanian even if his eyes were gouged out or his hands and feet were severed, but he shot the Jews because of an order.
The author completely dissects the tone of that letter, pointing out its melodramatic, highly unnatural cadence.
Yeah, it's a bit much.
It doesn't read like the desperate final thoughts of a doomed canteen worker. It reads like a piece of ideological theater.
It feels scripted.
Exactly. And the author explicitly theorizes that this suicide note, along with the other confessions, were fabricated wholesale by the Special Intelligence Service, the SSI.
It basically ties up all the loose ends of that impossible gendarmerie report with a neat, highly emotional bow. One that perfectly aligns with the state's need to brand the legionaries as bloodthirsty, unhinged fanatics.
Precisely. But beyond the dubious nature of the confessions, the author attacks the structural legality of the trial itself.
Right, based on the 1936 Penal Code.
Yes, they root their argument in the Romanian Penal Code of 1936. They point out a glaring procedural violation. The specific bodies of the alleged victims were never legally identified by the court in relation to the specific accused.
Okay, let's translate that legal theory into a mechanism the listener can really visualize.
Sure.
It's basically like prosecuting a bank robbery, where you never establish which bank was robbed, you never audit the vault to prove money was actually stolen, and you never trace the serial numbers of the cash.
Right.
But you still send a man to prison, simply because a police informant claims he saw him holding a ski mask. You are missing the absolute foundation of the crime.
You are describing the absence of corpus delicti, the body of the crime. Under standard jurisprudence, you cannot secure a murder conviction without a forensic link connecting a specific action by the defendant to a specific identified victim.
Right.
You cannot just point to a mass grave of unidentified bodies, point to a defendant, and legally declare he killed them.
Especially since the gendarmerie report itself admitted the bodies at Jilava had been stripped and looted by local villagers before the scene was ever secured.
Exactly. That destroyed any chance of individualized forensic identification.
So how on earth did the military judges legally justify the death sentences without corpus delicti? I mean, how do you get away with that?
Through the mechanisms of martial law.
Oh.
General Antonescu had recently enacted Decree number 3936. This was a draconian measure designed to ruthlessly suppress crimes against public order. Martial law fundamentally warps standard jurisprudence.
The rules just changed.
Completely. The burden of proof is lowered, and the objective shifts from discovering truth to restoring state authority. The author's thesis is that the tribunal wasn't convened to solve a murder, it was convened to legally sanitize the narrative.
They needed a guilty verdict on paper to retroactively justify their violent purge of the legionary movement.
Exactly.
Which forces us to look at the psychology of the state here. I mean, why would General Antonescu go to such immense, complex lengths, fabricating gendarmerie reports, forging suicide notes, staging military tribunals, just to frame his own political partners?
Right. What's the motive?
Yeah, what is the strategic motive for a cover-up of this magnitude?
To understand the motive, we really have to look at the unworkable friction of the National Legionary State. Antonescu was a traditional military conservative who craved absolute order.
Okay.
The legionaries were radical, populist, and chaotic. They were ostensibly sharing power, but they were fundamentally incompatible.
A recipe for disaster.
Yes. Antonescu's ultimate goal was to establish a centralized military dictatorship that was perfectly aligned with Nazi Germany, and the legionaries were an unpredictable obstacle to that absolute control.
He basically needed a justification to amputate them from the government.
Exactly. And the author highlights a critical geopolitical turning point, January 22nd, 1941.
The second day of the crisis.
Right. On that day, Adolf Hitler communicated his explicit support to Antonescu, effectively giving the general free rein to eliminate the legionaries and restore order.
Wow.
So once Antonescu had Berlin's blessing, he didn't just need to defeat the legionaries on the streets. He needed a narrative that painted them as so irreparably monstrous that removing them became a moral and political necessity.
And the author suggests Antonescu had actually been planning this amputation for weeks, right?
Yes, they point to a really fascinating event on December 23rd, 1940, roughly a month prior to the pogrom.
What happened?
Antonescu suddenly deployed over 2,000 heavily armed troops throughout the streets of Bucharest. There were no riots happening, there were no provocations. It was just a massive, unprompted military occupation of his own capital.
A show of force. The author interprets that December deployment as a dress rehearsal, don't they?
They do. They argue Antonescu was testing the logistical deployment of his forces, treating the capital city as a hostile theater of war, basically preparing for the inevitable crackdown.
The author also brings in the perspective of Ogun Cristescu, who was the head of the SSI, the secret police.
Right, the architect of the state's intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, and during a post-war trial, Cristescu made an incredibly cynical admission. He stated that the political strategy from the very beginning was to bring the legionary movement into the government for the express purpose of compromising them.
So the state could eventually, in his words, suppress it completely.
It's just wild. It was a strategy of controlled embrace followed by strangulation.
Exactly. You give the radicals enough rope to hang themselves, and if they don't hang themselves fast enough, well, the state apparatus is more than willing to build the gallows and tie the knot.
The author also paints a picture of deep institutional hypocrisy to erode any assumption that Antonescu's state acted with moral authority.
Oh, this part is really revealing.
Yeah. They point out that Antonescu championed these draconian anti-corruption laws. He decreed that embezzling over 1 million lei was punishable by death.
Right.
Yet simultaneously, Antonescu and his inner circle of former ministers were amassing massive, unaccounted-for wealth, purchasing luxury villas and duplexes.
The author is demonstrating that to Antonescu, the law was not a moral absolute. It was simply a weapon to be wielded against enemies and completely ignored by the elite.
Right, so this establishes the author's psychological profile of the state, a regime comfortable with vast hypocrisy, strategically planning the demise of its political partners, and possessing total control over the intelligence and judicial systems.
And from this foundation, the author finally pivots from deconstructing the old narrative to proposing their own alternative scenario.
Yeah, so what does this all mean? I mean, if the legionaries didn't have the trucks, the logistical capacity, or the tactical freedom to move 90 bodies to Jilava, who did?
The author presents what we can call the military theory.
Okay, the military theory. Walk us through it.
The author's theory operates on the brutal realities of martial law. During the state of siege, the military enforced a strict 10:00 p.m. curfew, and the author asserts that the army operated under shoot-on-sight orders for anyone violating that curfew.
Meaning the military was indiscriminately gunning down citizens in the streets?
Yes.
Jews, Christians, political dissidents, confused civilians, just anyone caught outside after dark was killed by military patrols.
Exactly, and the author theorizes that as the military cleared the streets, the casualties were gathered and transported to central processing locations, potentially the presidency of the Council of Ministers.
Okay.
At this point, the SSI Cristescu's secret police began reviewing the bodies.
And here is where the author's theory of a manufactured pogrom really takes shape.
Yes. The author suggests the SSI noticed a demographic reality among the curfew victims. The number of Jewish bodies was roughly equivalent to the number of Christian bodies.
Okay.
Recognizing the political utility of a racially motivated massacre, the SSI systematically separated the Jewish victims. They identified them through the mandatory identity documents all citizens carried at the time.
Oh, So they literally curated the dead.
They curated the dead.
Right.
And the author then argues that the military, and only the military, utilized their heavy logistical infrastructure, like the large-capacity army trucks that the legionaries lacked, to transport this curated group of Jewish victims out to the Jalava forest.
So they dumped the bodies to create a concentrated, localized mass casualty event.
Right.
They artificially concentrated the victims of a citywide military curfew enforcement into a single terrifying tableau in the woods.
And then, according to the author, the state engaged in a meticulously planned cover-up to obscure the origins of those bodies.
How so?
The author claims SSI agents initially photographed the dumped bodies while they were still fully clothed. Then, rather than securing the crime scene, the state agents deliberately withdrew.
They just left.
They just left. They allowed local villagers from Jalava to access the site and loot the corpses for 8 straight hours.
That's horrifying. But tactically, by allowing the bodies to be stripped naked and robbed of their identification, the SSI effectively destroyed the forensic chain of custody.
Exactly. When the gendarmerie finally arrived hours later to officially discover the scene, the victims were completely unidentifiable.
Right, because you can't tell if a naked body was shot in a forest or shot on a city street and moved there.
Exactly.
It's like a macabre theater production.
Right.
The state directs the play, moves the props, invites the looters to destroy the evidence, and then acts as the shocked audience when the curtain rises.
It is a theory of absolute narrative control. And the author points out how masterfully the SSI laundered this fabricated narrative through international diplomatic channels.
Well, right, the international observers.
Yeah. Yes, they look at the reports of foreign observers stationed in Bucharest, such as the United States Ambassador Frank Mott and the German Ambassador Manfred von Killinger.
Because the SSI knew that if they fed the lie to the ambassadors would cable it back to their capitals.
Right.
And suddenly the lie becomes international historical fact.
The author points to specific misinformation campaigns here. For example, Ambassador Mott reported horrific rumors of 60 Jews being skinned alive at a local slaughterhouse.
Good Lord.
But the author notes that this is physically incongruent with the reality of the burials, as the vast majority of victims were buried intact at the Philanthropia Cemetery.
Right.
But the truth of the rumor didn't actually matter. The psychological impact did. The SSI seeded these grotesque stories, the diplomats reported them as intelligence, and the narrative of a barbaric legionary pogrom was cemented into the global consciousness.
Which brings us to a massive historical paradox that I've been thinking about.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if this entire event was a cynical, logistical frame job engineered by General Antonescu's military, why did it survive the end of the war? I mean, the post-war communist regime that took over Romania despised Antonescu. They put him on trial and executed him. So why would a communist government willingly maintain and protect a lie invented by a fascist dictator?
It's a great question, and the author addresses this paradox with chilling pragmatism.
Okay.
The communist authorities maintained the lie because it was politically highly profitable for them.
Profitable how?
Well, the myth of the barbaric legionary pogrom provided the communists with an unassailable legal and moral justification to hunt down, imprison, and execute surviving members of the legionary movement for decades after the war.
Oh, wow. So the communists didn't care about the historical truth of 1941. They just cared about possessing a weapon to wield against their political enemies in 1950.
Exactly. The author notes that some legionaries remained imprisoned based on these exact charges until a general amnesty in 1964.
That's wild.
If the communists admitted Antonescu's army actually committed the murders, they would lose their judicial leverage over the far-right dissidents.
Consequently, the foundational lie was just never corrected in the state archives.
Never. And because the archives remain contaminated, the author argues that modern historians simply inherited the deception.
Right. The text specifically critiques Gene Ansel and his contributions to the 2004 final report on the Holocaust in Romania.
It does. It suggests that mainstream historiography has unwittingly adopted an uncorrected state-sanctioned fabrication as unquestioned truth.
Okay, we have spent an hour dissecting the author's textual analysis, their deconstruction of gendarmerie reports, and their logistical theories regarding military trials. But, historical theories built entirely on paper are inherently vulnerable.
They are.
And the author knows this. Which brings us to the climax of the text, where the author attempts to anchor their entire theoretical architecture to a single, buried physical reality.
Yes. The author issues the ultimate forensic challenge.
Okay, let's hear it.
They remind the reader of a critical fact regarding the aftermath of the massacre. The 116 Jewish victims were buried at the Philanthropia and Sephardic cemeteries entirely without autopsies.
Wait, really? No autopsies at all?
None. The state, rushing to close the case and sanitize the capital, simply put the bodies in the ground.
Which means the physical evidence of the murder, the terminal ballistic evidence, was never extracted. It was buried with them.
Exactly. The bullets that ended those lives are still in those graves right now, 85 years later.
Oh my.
And the author hinges their entire argument on the specific metallurgy and design of those buried projectiles.
This is where the distinction between the military and the legionaries becomes starkly physical, doesn't it?
It does.
The police records and armory manifests from 1941 show that the legionary movement was primarily armed with civilian or police-issue sidearms.
Right. Specifically, Mauser Model 1934 pistols.
Which fire a 7.65 millimeter rounded bullet.
Yes. Conversely, the Romanian army infantry, the troops enforcing the curfew, were equipped with military-grade weaponry. They fired 7.92 millimeter pointed ZB bullets designed for high-velocity rifles.
And the forensic difference between a rounded pistol bullet and a pointed military rifle caliber is massive.
Oh, huge.
And it doesn't degrade over time. So the author's final argument is basically a direct dare to the historical establishment.
A total dare.
They are effectively saying, stop reading the diaries of dictators and the cables of deceived ambassadors. Grab a shovel, go to the Philanthropia cemetery, exhume the remains, and subject them to modern ballistic analysis.
The author asserts with absolute confidence that an exhumation would yield 7.92 millimeter pointed ZB bullets.
Which would unequivocally prove the army, not the civilian rebels, committed the murders.
Right. They are betting the entirety of their historical revisionism on the physical presence of military ammunition in those graves. After 30 pages of agonizing over the semantics of 10-word diary entries, the author demands a return to the absolute binary of the X-ray.
It is a staggering way to conclude a historical study.
Truly staggering.
So, to summarize our journey today, we have unpacked a highly controversial, meticulously structured 2026 text that attempts a complete reversal of the 1941 Bucharest pogrom narrative.
Yes.
The author argues that the accepted history of a legionary massacre is actually the ghost of a false flag operation, orchestrated by General Antonescu's military.
Facilitated by the SSI's logistical cover-up.
Right, sustained by communist political pragmatism and just waiting to be exposed by the dormant ballistics buried in a Bucharest cemetery.
And we must reiterate at the conclusion of this deep dive that our role has been strictly analytical today.
Strictly analytical.
We have outlined the author's structural arguments, the logistical deductions, and the final forensic hypothesis. We are not endorsing these conclusions as historical fact.
Absolutely not.
The historical consensus surrounding these tragic events exists for a reason, and it is backed by decades of international scholarship. Our objective was solely to explore the mechanics of how this specific author attempts to challenge that consensus.
Right, we are just the guides through the architecture of the argument. But as we close, imagine the broader implications of the author's underlying philosophy for a second.
It's a lot to think about.
The entire text rests on this terrifying premise that the written archives of our history, like the police reports, the trial transcripts, the private diaries of leaders, can be entirely seamlessly fabricated by the regimes that possess the power to write them.
Yeah.
If the paper trail is inherently contaminated by the survival instincts of the state, how can we ever achieve absolute certainty about our past without digging up the physical proof for every single historical tragedy?
It's a huge question.
Are we placing too much faith in the ink of the archives and ignoring the forensic realities buried in the ground beneath our feet? I mean, if the X-ray machine is owned and operated by the suspect, how do we ever truly know the nature of the fracture?
It is a profound and deeply unsettling question regarding how we construct our memory of the past.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the muddy, complex waters of historical diagnostics. Keep analyzing the narratives you were given, keep looking for the mechanisms behind the history, and we will see you next time.